Father Lane here. Welcome to Washington as we continue our discussion of the background of Paul's letters. We've already discussed the who, what, where, and when of Paul's letters, and today we're going to look at the why Paul wrote his letters as he did. And as we do that, there's no better place to be than here in Washington, D.C. No, we're not here to talk about Baby Shark. Thank goodness. No, we're not here to talk even about the president's race or even about anything related to the executive branch. Instead, I want us to think about this other building that you can see faintly over the left field stands here at Nationals Park. You can see the dome of the United States Capitol, home to the House of Representatives and the Senate, where representatives and senators from all around the country come to our nation's capital to make the pleas of their constituents heard for the national government. At least that's how it's supposed to work. We won't get into gerrymandering here because this is a Bible video, not a politics video. But I digress. Here, what we're seeing in Paul's letters is something of the opposite. Whereas in Washington, representatives and senators come from around the country to one single location to advocate for their local interests, in Paul's letters, a single apostle goes and founds churches all around the Mediterranean world, bringing one message of salvation to all different groups of people. Let's take a look at a specific case of Paul doing just this. We know because he tells us in his letter to the Galatians that at the Council of Jerusalem, Paul was told by the other apostles to be mindful of the poor. And of course, he tells us that he was eager to do it. So Paul decides to take up a collection to benefit this poor church at Jerusalem. At this time, Jerusalem was a materially poor, persecuted church. And as Paul was founding all of these new churches in Gentile territory with members who were artisans, merchants, other people of means, Paul was going to take up a collection to help this church in Jerusalem. And he makes his appeal for participation in this collection in several different letters. We look here at 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1. Paul tells the Corinthian Christians that they should be generous just as were the Galatian Christians. He says that in 1 Corinthians. Then we go to 2 Corinthians, and Paul appeals to them even more strongly. He tells them, you know the gracious act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that for your sake he became poor although he was rich, so that by his poverty you might become rich. Notice what Paul does here. He's making a practical appeal. Chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians are all about this collection for the people of Jerusalem. Paul makes this very practical appeal, but he grounds it in theological truths. He grounds it here in Christology, in who Jesus is and in what the Lord did. His message is simple. Christ gave an example. We Christians are to follow it. So Paul encourages generosity from the Corinthian Christians. And then he reports in his letter to the Romans, he reports that he's taken up this collection, and then he says to the Romans, I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the holy ones. For Macedonia and Achaia, North and South Greece respectively, have decided to make some contribution for the poor among the holy ones in Jerusalem. And then at the end of the third missionary journey, Paul takes that collection to the people of Jerusalem. As an aside, notice the brilliant pastoral strategy here. Paul accomplishes a very temporal mission. He's gathering money while at the same time grounding it in the gospel. He's preaching the gospel, telling the people about Jesus, even as he accomplishes pastoral, practical objectives. This whole example provokes a few questions for us, however. First, how do we discover this theme about the collection from letters which have several different themes? One of the things we know about Paul's letters is that Paul often talks about a number of different things in the same letter. How do we avoid proof texting, but at the same time recognize all that's there, even when it doesn't seem all too well connected? Second, how do we justify the connections we make across the various letters, each with its own context? We've spoken in prior videos about the temptation to look at Acts of the Apostles because it looks like a neat narrative. Now, Acts has its own objectives, it has its own structure, but the letters too contain the story of Paul. But we have to do a little bit more work with them. We have to examine them and piece them together. How do we justify what we do? How do we justify our decisions? And third, how was St. Paul so successful? How did he in fact persuade the Galatians and the Corinthians to donate generously to this collection? We're going to look at all three of these questions. We're going to examine the first two in this video, and then we'll take the third in the next couple of videos. To these first two questions about how we justify the various exegetical decisions that we make, The first thing we want to make sure that we do is maintain a big picture view of the letter. We want to situate each letter as a snapshot within Paul's broader ministry and within his broader life. We also want to notice the vocabulary that he uses in his various letters. We looked at the example of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. Notice the word that he used for gracious act. It's the ordinary noun charis, often translated grace in New Testament Greek. You can see it's used a lot in the New Testament, and it's used disproportionately often within the Pauline corpus. What we notice is that Paul uses the same vocabulary here to describe a temporal gift, a gift of money or a gift of goods, that he often uses to describe a gift from God, a gift that God gives to us, something far less temporal. So what we're going to be able to do is to look at this vocabulary and connect the dots and see Paul uses this term broadly, and so we're going to be able to explore what does Paul understand grace to be. We also want to be attentive to the details when we're reading the text. We want to read very closely. This will be our primary task for the rest of the semester. As we go through each of the 13 Pauline letters, we're going to want to notice the details. We're going to want to notice when he mentions a location, we're going to want to find it on a map and think, what else happened here? When he mentions an event, when did that event happen? How does what I'm reading here fit into this broader picture? When I encounter a concept, a word that's used, especially if it's used in a number of different places in the Pauline corpus, how do these different usages connect? All of this is wonderful, but we also have to keep in mind the particularity of each letter. And when we do that, we want to look for principally four things, what I like to call the four epistolary elements. These four key details that are essential to any kind of communication by letter. Every letter, by definition, has a sender. There is someone writing the letter, and there are addressees, one or more people who will receive the letter. We have senders, we have addressees. A letter is a communication between senders and addressees. But it also doesn't come out of nowhere. There's always an inciting incident. There's a reason why Paul writes this letter. There is an occasion. Something has happened that has led Paul to pick up his pen and compose the letter. We want to figure out what that is. We want to know, why is Paul writing this letter? And then, given that inciting incident, what does Paul seek to persuade his audience to do, or think, or not do, or believe? What is the message of the letter? Some scholars use the term logos of the letter, which is just the Greek word for word or matter or message in this context. What's the point of the letter? So these four things, sender, addressees, the two main persons involved in the letter's communication, as well as the occasion, the past event, or at the time Paul's writing, the present event that is bringing about the letter, and then the future goal. What is the message? What is this letter designed to accomplish? What is Paul seeking to persuade his audience to do, think, believe, avoid, or so forth? Many of Paul's letters have more than one occasion. I'm thinking especially of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is a letter that, as we'll see going on later, is the result of multiple pieces of correspondence that have already been going on between Paul and the Corinthian Christians. There are several inciting incidents, which is why when we read 1 Corinthians, Paul seems to be changing topics chapter by chapter or bit by bit. It can read a little bit like a shopping list. We're going to want to figure out all that's going on as we're reading these letters. None of this is easy. Sometimes it can be very difficult, especially in the polemical letters that Paul writes. I'm thinking of Galatians, 2 Corinthians, parts of Philippians, and Colossians, where Paul is opposing what he considers to be false teaching. It's not so easy to figure out what were these other teachers holding. What were they in fact saying? We'll talk a little bit later about how we deal with these kinds of questions. But these are the four things we want to keep in mind: sender, addressees, occasion, and message. That helps us deal with those first two questions. Our third question, which considers how Paul in fact persuaded his audience, that's the topic of rhetoric. We'll explore that in our next couple of videos. Until then, read well and pray well.